Okay, Hawaii. So I would kind of categorize Hawaii's how they've been doing as it relates to COVID cases in kind of three distinct phases. So in the early days of the pandemic, they had a limited number of cases, and most of them, as you can see, the blue bars indicate travel-related cases, the red community. So kind of attributable to community spread. So they did have, being that they're kind of a tourist destination, they did have a number of travel-related cases in the beginning. But unlike some of the Sunbelt states that sort of resisted implementing restrictions when cases were low, they were pretty aggressive in the beginning about implementing travel restrictions. And so I think that that really spared them that May, June, July surge that you saw in states like Florida and Arizona. So they were doing pretty well up until June, but then cases really started to surge in July and August. And so I was really kind of curious about Hawaii and wanted to dig into what happened and where did things go wrong. So I'll start with what worked in the early days. So I think the unique geography, as we talked about last time with New Zealand, so it's an archipelago, it's an island state, 2,500 miles away from California. And so they really have great control over who comes in and out of the state. So early on, they instituted a strict 14-day quarantine. So every visitor had to register and say where they were, and they were kind of followed up with phone calls and things like that. So they were pretty strict with the compliance with that. And then, but you can see here, just this graph sort of shows the changes in arrivals from the same month last year. And basically, they kind of eliminated travel into the state. So as of April, visitor arrivals were down 99% from the prior year. And in addition to restricting travel into the state, they put strict lockdown measures on residents. But I think unlike New Zealand, Hawaii's economy is basically completely dependent on tourism. So it directly accounts for 12% of their GDP and almost 20% of their employment versus about 3% nationally. And that doesn't include all of kind of the tangential industries that rely on tourism just indirectly. So unemployment rose in May up to 23.5%. And that's up from 2.7% from the previous year. So really the only state that was doing worse than them was Nevada. And that's understandable because that's another economy that's kind of completely reliant on tourism and people coming into the state. So needless to say, there was a lot of pressure to reopen the state. I think, Hawaii, Nevada, these are definitely states where, one might say, is the cure worse than the disease? It's at least kind of worth having that conversation. I think they really moved forward with their reopening too quickly. So they started talking about reopening at the end of May, and by the early June, they were in phase 3, which was like bars, restaurants, childcare, gyms, all this stuff had resumed operations. So I think that, kind of digging into what went wrong, there were I think reopening inevitably led to a spike. That's something we've seen in every state. I think that's something that was inevitable. But really where they failed were in two places. And the first was testing. So there's been a lot of criticism of Hawaii's health officials. They had initially advised testing only individuals who displayed serious symptoms. And I think what we've seen is municipalities that have been pretty aggressive about testing people and testing asymptomatic people. It's really gone a long way in kind of controlling the spread. So they're ranked as one of the lowest, just in terms of like the overall testing that they've done. But really, I think the bigger, just reading some of the local papers in Hawaii, where people seem to be really criticizing them is in their contact tracing efforts. So for those of you who are pretty young and don't know, this is a fax machine. So their entire contact tracing effort relies on 2 fax machines, and some of them are occasionally, one or both of them is occasionally broken, which basically gets in the information from the doctors all over the state. And then they have a team, a process that's very inefficient, very manual, and utilizes a lot of outdated technology to go out and try to figure out who should quarantine and where do we need to be looking for the next cluster. Also, health experts estimate that they should have about just given their population, they have should have about 400 contact tracers, and they currently have around 100. And then kind of the third thing that I think they failed in was once cases started to surge, they did start reinstating lockdowns, but they did them kind of illogically. So based on what we know about this disease, it doesn't seem to spread. It's not as virulent outdoors. Really, where they've been able to trace, super spreader events or clusters, it's been in bars, at conferences, and things like that. But they closed down beaches, city parks, things like that. So really restricting people from being outside while leaving open gyms and restaurants and things like that. So many health experts were quite puzzled as to why they did that. So the technology, I think that, what they're trying to do and what they've talked about doing and what they've kind of done okay is in tracing people or managing people who come into the country. So they've digitized the quarantine check-in process. Before you go to Hawaii, you download this app. And it's not very sophisticated. It's basically a Google form, but you have to do screening and check-ins and things like that. They've talked about geofencing technology just to track visitors. So rather than checking in on an app, they can actually tell if you've gone outside of your quarantine. But really, I think that they probably should be focusing on their technology in managing the spread internally rather than or managing the virus within rather than keeping the virus out. And the only major advancements they've made in the contact tracing program is that they've introduced these fillable online PDFs to report cases just to kind of get away from the fax machines. But one article I read said they can't find enough R programmers to process them. So if anyone is looking for a job, they might want to consider going to Hawaii because they are looking for people that can do some processing of this stuff. So that's all I have.
Great job with the nice slides, and the mention of the fax machine and finding a job in Hawaii made me chuckle.
I liked your title too, Trouble in Paradise.
Yeah, another article I saw, which I thought about using, was Paradise Lost. Both work well.
Any question for Hawaii?
So one of the questions I had was basically in terms of the contact tracing, essentially. So do you know if they actually have to physically go to different locations, or are they sort of expected to, well, I mean, previously, were they expected to do it over phone or something, or?
For the contact tracing?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think the contact tracing they're doing by phone, but it's just the process of getting who, in fact, do they need to contact. Because these fax machine, these things come in, and then the health department is responsible for contacting the patient and getting the list of people that they've been around. But I mean, it's basically a completely manual process. There's no app that, I think other states have kind of been a little bit more sophisticated and
Got it.
Using some technology to notify people. I mean, I guess I'll give an example. The other day I went to the public library and I had to fill out, I had my temperature taken, but I had to fill out on a sheet of paper, like my name, my address. And I think Hawaii, like that's kind of how they're doing things, but even less sophisticated than that, because you don't have to fill out a paper form that says where you were. You just kind of have to say, I was with this person, I was with that person. And then their contact tracers, which are grossly understaffed, have to go out and try and find those people to tell them to quarantine.
Got it. And so is this funded by the current state department?
This is a state government. Mm-hmm. So this falls under the state government.
Okay. Because from what at least I remember, so the other states like New York State and stuff also has collaborations with different entities, like for example, the
Counties.
Bloomberg Foundation.
Oh, okay. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so actually a huge chunk of funding to the contact tracing, volunteers actually comes from these foundations. So I was just curious to see if there were different funding agencies that also worked with the state government.
No, not that I'm aware of. I think also, since this is such a recent development, Hawaii is sort of last on the, curve to be spiking. This is all sort of, the news on this is all within the past couple of weeks, and they've had, Department of Health officials resigning and being forced out, and so it's kind of still a mess over there.
Okay.